stretch to the stake. In the summer of 1546, Henry VIII's London witnessed one of the most brutal executions of the era. At just 25 years old, Anne had become known as an outspoken Protestant preacher, distributing banned religious texts and publicly challenging Catholic doctrine. Her defiance caught the attention of Thomas Wriothesley, the Lord Chancellor, who saw in her a path to uncover larger Protestant networks. On June 28th, Anne was taken to the Tower of London for interrogation. When she refused to name fellow reformers, Wriothesley ordered her torture on the rack. Unlike most prisoners, Anne's interrogators did not stop at the standard level of stretching. They continued to turn the wheel until her shoulders and hips were physically pulled from their sockets. The pain was excruciating, her ligaments tearing audibly as her joints separated. Despite the agony, Anne remained silent. Witnesses reported that she did not scream, though her body convulsed with each turn of the wheel. By the time they finished, her limbs hung loosely from her torso, the connective tissue irreparably damaged. She could no longer stand or walk. On July 16th, Anne was carried to Smithfield on a chair. Unable to walk to her own execution, she was bound to the stake in a sitting position. As the kindling was lit beneath her, witnesses saw her remain conscious, her eyes clear and aware as the flames began to climb. The fire started slowly, first burning her legs while she was still fully alert. Smoke filled her lungs, causing her to gasp for air that only brought more heat and pain. Her skin blackened and peeled away as the flames rose higher. It took nearly 30 minutes for Anne to lose consciousness as her body was consumed from the feet upward. By the time her heart stopped, most of her lower body had been reduced to ash, while onlookers watched in horror. Aged and axed. On May 27, 1541, the Tower of London became the scene of one of the most botched executions in Tudor history. At 67 years old, Margaret was the last surviving member of the Plantagenet dynasty, a bloodline that had ruled England for over 3 centuries. Her royal blood made her both valuable and dangerous to the Tudor monarchy. King Henry VIII had kept Margaret in the Tower for nearly 2 years without trial. That morning, with no warning, she was informed she would die within the hour. Unlike most noble prisoners, she was given no time to prepare herself mentally or spiritually. The king had ordered her immediate removal. Margaret was led to the execution site on Tower Green, where a small crowd had hastily gathered. No professional executioner was present. Instead, a young, inexperienced axeman had been assigned the task. Witnesses described him as nervous, his hands visibly shaking as Margaret knelt at the block. The first blow missed her neck entirely, striking her shoulder and causing a gaping wound. Margaret, still conscious, screamed in pain. The second strike hit the back of her head, slicing into her skull, but not killing her. Blood poured down her gray hair as she remained aware of what was happening. The axeman, now panicking, struck wildly. The third blow hit her neck, but not deeply enough. The fourth, fifth, and sixth blows landed on her back and shoulders as she tried to move away. Witnesses reported that it took 11 strokes before Margaret's head was finally severed from her body. Throughout most of the ordeal, she was conscious, feeling each strike as the axe tore through muscle and bone. Her body, still twitching from nerve responses, was dragged away unceremoniously, denied even the dignity of a proper burial. Her head, gray-haired and marked by multiple wounds, was displayed briefly before being disposed of without ceremony. Floor of scandal. On September 8, 1560, a mysterious death at Cumnor Place would spark centuries of speculation. Amy was the 28-year-old wife of Robert Dudley, the handsome courtier widely known to be Queen Elizabeth I's favorite. Their marriage had become increasingly strained as Dudley spent most of his time at court, leaving Amy alone at their country estate. That Sunday morning, Amy insisted that her entire household staff attend the local fair, leaving her completely alone in the house. When the servants returned that evening, they found the manor eerily quiet. Upon searching, they discovered Amy's body at the bottom of a short stone staircase, her neck twisted at an unnatural angle. The position of the body puzzled investigators from the start. Amy lay on her back with her neck broken, but her headdress remained perfectly in place. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood splatter on the walls, and no defensive wounds on her hands or arms. It appeared as though she had simply fallen backwards down just a dozen steps. Examinations revealed that her neck had been broken cleanly between the third and fourth vertebrae. Modern medical experts suggest this type of injury is rare in simple falls, especially down such a short staircase. The clean break pointed to a sudden, powerful force, perhaps a deliberate twist rather than impact trauma. Amy had been complaining of chest pains in the weeks before her death. Some historians believe she may have had breast cancer that had metastasized to her spine, weakening the bones and making them susceptible to fracture, even from a minor fall. Others point to the convenience of her death for her husband, who might have become king consort had he been free to marry the queen. The coroner officially ruled the death an accident, but Elizabeth's court buzzed with darker theories. The suspicious timing and unusual circumstances prevented Dudley from ever marrying the Queen, the scandal too potent to overcome. Monks ripped apart. On June 19, 1535, Tyburn Gallows hosted a state-sanctioned slaughter meant to terrify a nation. 3 monks, John Houghton, Augustine Webster, and Robert Lawrence, had refused to swear the oath of supremacy, acknowledging Henry VIII as head of the Church. Their resistance marked them as traitors in the eyes of a king desperate to solidify his religious authority. After a swift trial at Westminster, the 3 were sentenced to death by hanging, drawing, and quartering, the most severe punishment in English law. On the morning of their execution, they were dragged on hurdles through the streets of London. The rough wooden platforms scraped against the cobblestones, tearing the monks' robes and skin as they were pulled for over 2 miles. At Tyburn, before a crowd of thousands, the monks were cut down from the hurdles. Unlike most condemned prisoners, they showed no fear. Witnesses reported their faces remained calm as nooses were placed around their necks. The first phase of execution began as they were hoisted up on the gallows, not long enough to die, but just until near strangulation. Cut down while still conscious, each monk was laid on a table. The executioner used a knife to cut through their abdomens while they were fully aware. John Houghton, the senior monk, reportedly remained conscious enough to speak as the executioner's hands entered his body cavity. "Oh, Jesus, what will you do with my heart?" he whispered as the organ was removed. Their intestines were pulled out slowly, foot by foot, and burned before their still-living eyes. The pain was unimaginable, nerve endings firing as internal organs were exposed to air. Death came only after the heart was cut out, ending the conscious suffering. But the bodies were then beheaded and quartered, the parts boiled in tar to preserve them for display. Their heads and body parts were displayed on London Bridge and at monastery gates throughout the city, a warning to any who might defy the king's religious authority, the husband who fell from grace. In December 1541, a former royal favorite learned the terrible price of the king's jealousy. As secretary to Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's 5th wife, Derham had secured a position at court that many envied. What few knew was that before her marriage to the king, Catherine and Francis had been lovers, even referring to each other as the husband and wife. When rumors of Catherine's past relationships reached the king, investigators quickly identified Derham as a primary figure. Under interrogation at the Tower, Derham admitted to his prior relationship with Catherine, but denied any contact after her marriage. This distinction meant little to Henry, who had once showered Catherine with affection and now burned with rage at her perceived betrayal. On December 10th, Derham was taken from his cell and tied to a wooden hurdle. Unlike the noble traitors who received quick beheadings, Derham faced the full horror of a commoner's execution. Dragged through London streets, his back scraped raw against the cobblestones, he arrived at Tyburn conscious and fully aware of what awaited him. The executioner hoisted him up on the gallows, but only briefly, not long enough for his neck to break. Cut down while gasping for air, Derham was laid on a table as his breeches were removed. The crowd fell silent as the executioner pulled out a sharpened knife. Still fully conscious, Derham felt the blade slice through his lower abdomen, cutting deep enough to expose his intestines. Witnesses reported seeing him flinch and hearing his screams as the executioner reached inside the wound. The pain was excruciating as his intestines were pulled out and thrown into a fire lit beside the scaffold. Derham remained alive, watching his own organs burn. The executioner then cut deeper, removing his heart while he was still breathing. Only then did consciousness fade. His body was quartered, each limb severed with careful precision. The parts were parboiled to prevent rapid decay, and his head was placed on London Bridge, a stark reminder of royal vengeance. Shock for a young king. In January 1553, the Tudor dynasty faced a crisis as its only male heir battled an invisible enemy. At just 15 years old, Edward had been king for 6 years, ascending to the throne after his father Henry VIII's death. Described as intelligent and devout, the young monarch had seemed to be in good health until a persistent cough developed during a cold winter. By February, Edward was experiencing periodic fevers. Court physicians diagnosed a cold humor and prescribed herbal remedies and rest. The symptoms temporarily subsided, giving hope to his counselors. But in April, the king suffered a dramatic relapse. His breathing became labored and he began coughing up blood-tinged phlegm. Modern medical experts believe he was suffering from tuberculosis, a disease that slowly consumed the lungs. As May arrived, Edward's condition deteriorated rapidly. His once robust frame had withered, his skin taking on a gray pallor. The king's personal journals, which had been filled with meticulous handwriting, became increasingly erratic and eventually stopped altogether. Witnesses described how Edward would wake in the night gasping for air, his pillows soaked with sweat. By June, the young king could no longer leave his bed. His legs and abdomen began to swell with fluid, a sign of heart failure secondary to his pulmonary condition. The court watched helplessly as their monarch suffered. Foreign ambassadors were denied access to prevent rumors of the king's imminent death from spreading too quickly. In early July, Edward experienced periods of delirium, alternating with moments of lucidity where he was acutely aware of his failing body. His lungs, filled with fluid and pockets of infection, made each breath a conscious struggle. On July 6th, after a day of severe respiratory distress, Edward was seen to make one final effort to sit up. He whispered something to his attendant, then fell back on his pillows. At around 8 p.m., the king's breathing became shallow and irregular. By 9 p.m., Edward Tudor, the last male heir of Henry VIII, was dead. His body, wasted by disease, was a shadow of the healthy boy who had taken the throne 6 years earlier. First priest under Elizabeth. On June 19, 1573, Elizabeth and England demonstrated that religious tolerance remained a distant dream. Woodhouse was a Catholic priest who had been operating in secret since Elizabeth I's Protestant government had made his faith illegal. For over a year, he had moved between safe houses, celebrating forbidden mass and providing spiritual comfort to those who still followed Rome. His capture came after a raid on a private home in Lincolnshire, where he had been saying mass. Unlike many priests who attempted to hide their true purpose, Woodhouse made no effort to conceal his identity or mission. During his imprisonment in London's Fleet Prison, he even wrote directly to Lord Burghley, the Queen's chief advisor, urging him to persuade Elizabeth to submit to the Pope's authority. This brazen challenge sealed his fate. On June 16, 1573, Woodhouse was tried for high treason at the Guildhall. The verdict was never in doubt. 3 days later, he was taken from his cell and strapped to a hurdle, a wooden frame that was dragged by horses through the streets toward Tyburn. The journey took nearly an hour, his body bumping over cobblestones, opening wounds that bled through his clothing. At Tyburn, a crowd had gathered to watch the first priest executed under Elizabeth's reign. Woodhouse was allowed to speak briefly. Witnesses reported he forgave his executioners and prayed for the Queen's conversion. Then the hangman placed a noose around his neck and hoisted him up, not long enough to die, but enough to experience the crushing pressure on his throat and the panic of oxygen deprivation. Cut down while still conscious, Woodhouse was laid on the execution table. The executioner cut open his abdomen with a sharp knife, the pain causing his body to convulse. Onlookers described how Woodhouse's eyes widened as the executioner reached inside and pulled out his intestines. These were thrown into a brazier of hot coals while he watched, still alive and aware. The executioner then reached deeper, cutting the arteries around Woodhouse's heart. As blood filled his chest cavity, consciousness finally faded. His body was quartered, the parts displayed at various locations around London as a warning to other Catholic priests. A bear in the bed. In the winter of 1570, residents of Herefordshire confronted a death so bizarre it defied explanation. Agnes was a widow who lived alone in a small cottage near Ross-on-Wye, where a traveling entertainer had recently established a temporary bear garden, a venue where bears were kept for the popular blood sport of bear baiting. On the night of January 23rd, temperatures dropped to freezing, with heavy snow blanketing the countryside. Shortly before midnight, residents near the bear garden were awakened by unusual noises. The sound of wood splintering and the distinctive roar of a bear. One of the animals, a large male weighing over 400 pounds, had broken free from its chain. Rather than fleeing into the woods, the bear, likely drawn by the smell of food, headed toward the nearest dwellings. Agnes's cottage, standing somewhat isolated from others, became the bear's target. Investigators later determined that the animal had forced its way through her poorly secured door. Agnes, asleep in her bed, had no warning. The first indication of danger would have been the heavy footsteps on her floor and the animal's distinctive odor. The following morning, when Agnes failed to appear in the village, neighbors checked her home. What they discovered horrified even those accustomed to the violence of Tudor England. Agnes's body lay in what remained of her bed, her chest cavity torn open. The bear had mauled her face beyond recognition, crushing her skull with a single bite powerful enough to penetrate bone. Examination of the body revealed that Agnes had not died immediately. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated she had been conscious for the initial attack, attempting to push the animal away. Blood spatter patterns showed she had moved across the room before being dragged back to the bed. The worst discovery was evidence suggesting she had remained alive for several minutes as the bear began consuming parts of her torso. The bear was later found and killed less than a mile from the cottage, still with human blood on its muzzle. Local authorities debated whether the entertainer should face charges for the death, but ultimately classified it as a tragic accident, though rumors of a deliberately released bear persisted for decades.